Hola, mis amigos. My name is Jim Lang, and I am from the University of Notre Dame in the United States. I'm looking forward to talking to you today about small teaching. Um, by the way, that was the only Spanish you're going to hear in this presentation from me. I have a good reading knowledge of Spanish, but not so much speaking. But the good news is there is a new translation of small teaching in Spanish, so I hope that you can hear the ideas here, but then also go dive more deeply into the ideas if you're interested in the book after we're done here today. So small teaching is a very simple idea. The idea is that we tend to think about changing education by, bringing in some new programs, some new ideas, new revolutionary ways to think about education, innovations. Those things are all great. But for many teachers who don't have time or the resources to make those kinds of changes, the research, I would argue, tells us that we can make small changes that will make a very strong and positive difference to student learning in our courses and to more education more generally. That's why I call this like a model for a pedagogical change, which I think can be very impactful if we're aware of how the learning research can support those changes. That's essentially the big principles of the book are look at what the research tells us about how humans learn, then find small ways to put that research into practice. So that's what we'll talk about for the next 20 or 30 minutes here, give you a sense of what that looks like and some ideas for application. The best way for me to explain small teaching is to show you a study. This study was conducted in the 1980s by some researchers who looked at two pairs of classes in which students listened to lectures from a lecturer and then took a test on the material they'd just been lectured on immediately afterwards. So they had the students in these two different pairs of classes, um, same material for the lecture and same test afterwards. So the one group of students heard the lecture continuously. They had to sit there and listen for 45 minutes and then take the test. But the other pair of classes did something slightly different. The slight difference was they asked the lecturer to pause 3 times for 2 minutes each. During that time, the instructor didn't do anything. The students could sort of talk to each other, check their notes, just think about what they had been learning about, and then the lecture would resume. So the researchers then looked at the tests between the two pairs of classes. And here's what they found. The numbers I'm going to show you right now are the total number of items that the students could recall from those 45-minute lectures. And what you see here is the power of a small change. The students in the no pause condition were able to remember about 80 facts total from those lectures, from the lecture. The other group in the pause condition was able to remember about 110 facts from the lecture. So you see here, now this is a change that required sort of no extra work from the lecturer. It was just very simple. Didn't require a lot of thinking or effort in terms of making a change to a class period. Maybe a little have to squeeze the lecture material in a slightly smaller time, but not that big of a deal. And that change you see here is making a real difference for the students. So that's the idea of small teaching. We're going to look for these little places where we can try something new, a little bit different, and have it and observe this kind of impact on student learning. So small teaching here is I'll give you kind of 3 principles for this. First, it invites attention to the everyday decisions that we make as we're designing and conducting our courses. So, the things that we do like a everyday basis in the classroom, but also like maybe our syllabus design or the way we think about our assessments or the feedback we give. So those everyday decisions that we do as teachers. Secondly, draw some research on how people learn and from our experiences with colleagues within and outside of higher education. So those two different things there. First of all, there's a huge body of research now on how people learn, and people are trying to apply that research to education. In the past, it was often separated. Like this was like learning research from how brains work, and there's sort of educational research in what goes on in the classroom. And now I think researchers are trying to put those things together in a very positive way. But that research there's so much of it now, actually, in the last few decades. Small teaching, the final thing it does is sort of offers inroads from that body of research. There's like small number of ways you can apply that learning research to classroom practices, course design, student feedback, assessments, all that stuff. So those are the principles that underlie small teaching. In terms of what it actually looks like in the classroom, I typically talk about three different ways which we can sort of apply to small teaching. The first is a few minutes dedicated to a new thing or new activity or strategy in a single class period that might happen multiple times over the course of the semester. So, for example, I'm going to do something a little bit different in the first few minutes of class once a week, or a few minutes in the final minutes of class every day. So those are, like looking for these little moments where we can take just a few minutes away from our normal patterns to try something a little bit different, to shake things up a little bit, but then also to draw from the research about what would help students learn more effectively. Secondly, second kind of small teaching change is like what a small number of activities, right? Interventions in like an entire course. So, for example, let's say you have a good activity that we know, like a learning activity that we know is very powerful, but it might take an entire class period, but only need one class period over the course of the entire course. So that's an example of another kind of small teaching change. And finally, small modifications to minor changes to the design of the course, the assessments, or the communication that we have with students, whether that's feedback or just the way we talk about the course in a syllabus or learning management system. So, any of the ways we might communicate with students over the course of the semester. So small changes that might make a difference there as well. Okay, so those are the sort of premises of small teaching. This is what it looks like. And the ideas there coming from the research is really important, and then trying to find and funnel these the research into these small everyday practices. Okay, so let's talk a little about what some of those look like. In the book, there are 9 principles which I use to find applications for learning research. In this our short time together here today, I'm going to give you just 2. And I hope that these 2 will sort of be enough to whet your appetite, inspire you to go look more deeply at some other possibilities. And even these 2 principles I'm going to show you, I'm going to give you a small number of things, application ideas for there too. And there are many for each principle. So I hope that these will, maybe everyone will find at least one that might make sense for their particular teaching context. Okay, the first thing we're going to talk about is what the researchers call retrieval practice. Retrieval practice is how we help students, or how anyone masters foundational knowledge, facts, information, concepts, like the process of like a basic skill. For example, how do you go about solving having memorized the process for solving a problem, a routine, all that stuff. The stuff that's kind of we might think about as stuff that needs to be here in my memory for me to then do other kinds of work as a learner. Now, I like to start with this one because there's a misconception in education sometimes that that's not important anymore, especially in recent decades, because we have so much information available to us all the time, right? Through our phones, our laptops, now through artificial intelligence. So do we actually need to memorize stuff anymore? Do we have to have basic stuff mastered anymore? The research tells us yes. The research on learning absolutely tells us it's very important for us to still have foundational knowledge in our brains to do the kind of deeper thinking that we hope that students will do. So Dan Willingham is a cognitive psychologist, and he explains it like this. So the thinking that we want students to do requires knowing facts. The very process that we care most about, like critical thinking, reasoning, problem solving, these things are intimately intertwined with factual knowledge that is stored in here, not just in our laptops or devices or our phones or AI, right? So when we do actually problem solving, for example, or reasoning, we're actually pairing 2 different things together. What's going on in the environment, and that environment could include information we're getting from digital sources with what's already in here. And so that process is kind of always playing out when we're doing critical thinking, creative thinking, trying to really solve problems, answer questions, raise questions, the things that we really care about, right? Those things depend upon a strong foundation of basic knowledge. So I think, as I said, it's kind of a misconception people have now, and especially with the higher you go up in education, people say, I'm not concerned about that kind of stuff. I just want to get students right to the deep thinking. And what I'm suggesting here is that the learning research tells us that's a mistake. You can't jump over that foundational knowledge mastery. So given that foundational knowledge is really important, and you can find more in the book about supporting for this kind of research you see from Dan Willingham. Given that this is really important still for people to be able to master foundational knowledge, what helps? What helps people master foundational knowledge? And so we're talking a little bit about that idea here of like a technique that researchers have discovered is really important. That technique is called retrieval practice. So I'll talk you through a study that I think really illustrates this issue very well. This study has some researchers at the University of Washington in St. Louis, in the United States, had students come into a laboratory and listen to 3 art history lectures 3 days in a row. Each lecture was about 30 minutes long. And so the students would listen to the lecture and then, go back to their everyday lives, come back the next day, listen to another lecture that happened 3 days in a row. Then they sent the students away and they brought them back 30 days later. And they sort of then said, okay, so how would they do on a test on those 3 lectures they had heard 30 days ago? Now, as they were doing the lectures, they were listening to the lectures on those 3 days, the students were actually in 4 different conditions. In the first condition, the students would hear the lectures and then just walk right out of the room. And so that's often what happens in a classroom, right? We hear a lecture, students might hear a lecture and participate in discussion, and they just walk out at the end of the day. The second group, an opportunity to look at a focus study guide, which contains some of the key terms from the lecture that day for a few minutes at the end of class in the lecture. The third group took a multiple choice quiz at the end of the lecture based on the material they had just been lectured about. Listen to a 30-minute lecture, take a multiple choice quiz about it. Finally, they had the fourth group of students took a short answer quiz on the material they had just been lectured about. Okay, so that's the basic design there. So when the students came back 30 days later, they gave them a test on the material. And here's what they found. If the students just walked out of the room after any of those lectures, they got about an average 20% on that test, which is not that great, obviously, but it's important to keep in mind that this was not in a class. So students were sort of hearing these lectures separate from their other kind of schoolwork. So the numbers here are lower than we would hope to see in an actual course. Okay, so no activity. If they had a few minutes at the end of the class period to look at a focused study guide, review the key terms from the lecture, it did help. Up to 35% from that group. It helped just as much as a multiple choice quiz. The group of students that took a multiple choice quiz were able to then do a little bit better about that test 30 days later. Now, before I go to the last one, just quick to note here, I said small teaching changes can be at the end of the class period, and you see here a very small thing was happening. A few minutes at the end of the class, at the lecture period, was making a difference 30 days later on the students' final exam. But you see the one that made the most difference to the students was the short answer question. So now we're close to 50% in terms of how they did in that test. So we went from 20% to 47% here, just from students asking some short answer, answering some short answer questions at the end of the class period. So we see this is a really good demonstration of, again, the power of a small change at the end of a class period. Now, so what causes that? Like, why do the students, did so much better when they were forced to answer questions about the material right after the lecture period? Michelle Miller is a cognitive psychologist from the United States. And explains here, in our long-term memories, the issue is not so much storage. We tend to think, well, I have to cram stuff in my long-term memory to really have something mastered. But Miller and other scientists tell us actually, the issue is not so much cramming stuff in there, it's getting it back out again. That's why they call it retrieval practice. The idea is that so you want to have this sort of opportunities to kind of, as she explains here, it's like having this big and messy closet. That's what your memory is like, right? We all remember like random things from our childhood, song lyrics, right? Random experiences throughout our lives, right? So there's a lot of stuff in there. But if we don't think about it, if we don't sort of recall it and articulate it, like those students do with the short answers, it doesn't, we sort of lose access to it. So that's why we call it retrieval practice. To really sort of solidify something in our long-term memories, we have to practice retrieving it from our memories and using it. And so that's what was happening in those short answers. They had to sort of retrieve what they had heard from the lecture and then apply it as they were answering a short answer question. Okay, so this is another quote from Dan Willingham right after that, following up that. And now this is a very sort of succinct way to say it. Memory is the residue of thought. We remember what we think about. And going further then, not only do we remember things that we think about, but also that we articulate. And so retrieval practice has to kind of have those components to it. So you're going to sort of make sure that I learned something new. I have to then articulate it again in some way, writing, speaking it, and then also having to think about it in order to do that work of writing or speaking or solving a problem, whatever it might be. So that's the sweet spot of retrieval practice. I have to retrieve it and do something with it. As you see from the study that I just showed you, that doesn't have to be huge. It doesn't have to be like a huge amount of activity or like a really intensive activity. It can happen in just a few minutes. And so that's, again, a perfect example of small teaching. Okay, so what does this mean for us who teach in terms of actual classroom practices? So we can think about different ways to apply this research. First of all, we can sort of acknowledge the fact that quizzes do this work for us, actually. When we ask students to take quizzes, just like the students did at the end of every day in those 3 days, they took quizzes, and it had an impact for them when they're doing the final exam based on those 3 lectures, right? So the more that we can actually have students take quizzes, it really helps them. I know that they think it's like a punishment or that's sort of just testing where they're actually studying, but actually quizzing is a really potent learning tool. Now, if we use it for a learning tool and not as like a tool just designed to kind of checking up on students, we might think about lowering the stakes on quizzes with some of these kinds of strategies here. So for example, drop scores. So you have 10 students, 10 quizzes, but you only count 8 of them. That kind of lowers the pressure. So students are not going to be thrown off by one bad quiz over the course of a class. Or give opportunities for limited retakes. So for example, students, again, 10 quizzes, you can retake 2 of them. So if you didn't do very well on one of them, you can retake 2 of them, right? So that, again, lowers the stakes. Finally, 2-stage quizzes. This is interesting research on this as well. This technique consists of students coming into class, taking a quiz on a material, turning it in, and then retaking the quiz in a small group of students so they can help each other remember things together. So supporting and reinforcing that retrieval practice with each other. And the instructors who use this strategy, sometimes will average those 2 scores together, the individual quiz and the group quiz. Like for example, individual quiz grades are like 75% and the group quiz is 25%. And so there's different ways to do that. But the point here is that quizzes help people learn. And so we shouldn't run away from that practice because I think it is a quite potent learning tool. Actually, sometimes the retrieval practice is sometimes called the testing effect because again, we think about tests as being like a measurement tool for learning. But again, we know now that testing itself is a good way to help support learning, testing and quizzing. Okay, so that for me, that's like an obvious implication from the research I just showed you. Here's a couple of different ones that get away from sort of graded work. we can think about the fact that the beginning of the class is a great opportunity to ask students retrieve material they've learned about in the previous class period. This is a very simple activity. So many of us come into class and we say, okay, here's what we did last time. This modification would say, instead of me doing that work, I'm going to say to the students, okay, before we start today, what did we learn last time? Tell me, one or two, three things that we learned that we talked about last time, or that you heard from the lecture last time, or that were from your reading last night, right? And then just sort of invite students to engage in that conversation. And maybe you sort of write things down on the board, or you respond to the things that students are saying. Maybe remind them about, oh yeah, that's good. We also talked about this. So we can think about different ways to reinforce what they're saying is to us. So that's one way to do it. Even adding to that, making it more challenging for retrieval practice, go back earlier in the syllabus and say, you can have students bring the syllabus every day and say, okay, today, it's the 10th week of the semester. I want us to go back in the 5th week, and I want you to think about, what do we do that week? You can look at like here are the course topic for this day, Wednesday of the 5th week, right? What do you remember about that? What do we do that day? Now, this is challenging for a student. This is very challenging. It'd be challenging for any of us. But the more we do this, the more we are helping them, help put things in that like long-term memory, that foundational knowledge that they will need, not only in the final exam or the final project, but then beyond the class, right? When they're going to their new classes or the next classes or their careers, whatever it might be. So the more that we can do this, the more we are helping them master that knowledge. So beginning of class is one way to do this. And then, of course, we can just think about the end of the class too. So in the close of class, we might ask students again, we can stop class 5 minutes early to say, okay, so what's the most important thing you learned in class today? What's the most important thing you learned from the reading you did last night or for your homework? And what questions you might have, or what things you're not sure about based on today's class period. Because even that does require students to think about, what are they unclear about, or what they want to know more about based on today's class period. These are all things, again, that tweak that retrieval. They have to get stuff out of their brains to do this work, but then they have to do something with it, right? Make a judgment. What was the most important thing today? What am I still confused about? So we're hitting that sweet spot of retrieving and also using it, the knowledge for something important. Okay, final example I'm going to show you is my favorite way to use retrieval practice in the classroom, and something I call connection notebooks. Connection notebooks are the ways that I use in my own course. I have my students actually bring like a blue book, like a blue exam book, which are in the United States, we use these blue exam books where students will take handwritten exams in those blue books. You can do the same thing online through like a discussion board as well. So it doesn't have to be a blue book or like any kind of notebook. But the idea here is that at the end of the class period, so for me, I do this once a week. I'll ask the students to take out their blue books and write a 1-paragraph response to what I call a connection question. So for example, I'm going to ask them to say, tell me how something we did today appears or connects to something you experienced in your life beyond this class period. So, or tell me how something we talked about today, how can you connect to something that you'll experience in your intended career, or a career that you hope to be in. So how can you connect something we did today to your potential career? Or, this is actually my favorite one, tell me how something we did today connects to something you've learned in another course. This really requires some thinking here. So how could we connect something we did today in chemistry to your political science course, or in literature class to your anthropology course, or whatever it might be, right? Really forcing them to go deep and think. Okay, so first of all, again, we're thinking about, I have to remember something we did in class today, so that's the retrieval part, but then really thinking deeply about it, critically, creatively, about how they can put these things together in new, interesting ways. That will sort of deepen the learning that comes from retrieval practice. Okay, so those are our 4 strategies I'm going to show, recommend for this, this particular principle, retrieval practice. So we talked about here, at the beginning of class period, asking students to remember what some previous things that they did in the previous class period. In this class period, actually asking for ask them to remember from the previous class period or prior class periods. These are out of order. I apologize. And then, of course, also take advantage of the learning power of quizzes. So you can think about how we can lower the stakes on quizzes with drop scores, through limited retakes, that kind of thing. We talked about the end of the class period, close class with some students having writing down the most important concept for the day or things they're unclear about. And finally, the connection notebook, something that you can do, have students respond to something from the class period, and then talking a little bit about what it means for something outside of the, from the course content from that day, something outside of the class period. Okay, so those are ideas for retrieval practice. And that's my way to kind of think about small teaching coming out of this body of research about retrieval practice and its power for learning. Okay, so let's talk a little bit now about inclusive teaching or student engagement. So let's say you design these great learning activities with retrieval practice. How do you make sure that students engage in them? Right? How do you make sure that they can actually, they're going to do these things instead of just sort of sitting there and not really doing them, right? How do we make sure that all students are participating in the learning activities that we know are good for them, but sometimes they don't want to do, or sometimes they feel like maybe they have some anxiety about speaking in class, or they might have anxiety about graded activities. How do we make sure all students are participating in a learning activity in a class period? That's what the second principle is about, student engagement. Okay, so I'm going to introduce, I'm going to introduce a body of research that comes from a sociologist named Jay Howard. And Jay Howard talks about what he calls participation norms. So Jay Howard studies the classroom. That's his area of sociology, is what happens in college classrooms. His research is based on college classrooms, but I think it applies to all education levels. So the idea here is that when we walk into a classroom, when students walk into a classroom, there are certain norms that shape how they participate. And Howard explains that there are norms that in all our social spaces, right? So we have norms that shape and govern how we interact with each other in any social space. Let's give the example of an elevator, right? So when you walk into an elevator, there are certain norms about how you behave, right? So those norms we just sort of absorb, like over the course of our life from childhood. We sort of learn how to behave in an elevator. In the United States here, you walk into the elevator, you turn around and face the door, and you typically don't start deep conversations with people in an elevator. You might say hello, but beyond that, you kind of just walk in, hit the button, and turn around and keep yourself quiet. That's the norm of elevator behavior in the United States. So Howard takes that idea and says, okay, so what are the norms that happen in a classroom? And Howard argues that the norms that are operating in classrooms are often ones that shut students down. As a result, we teachers have to reshape those norms to ensure greater levels of participation amongst the students. So he gives one good example of a norm that often is a negative one in a classroom. He calls it the consolidation of responsibility. Consolidation of responsibility means that when you throw out a question in class, we all have the experience of there's 3 students who go like this immediately, right? They raise their hands, they want to participate, they're engaged, and that happens every day. Whenever you throw out a question, there's a small number of students who want to participate, be engaged. But because those students are so engaged, everyone else in the room can just sit back and not engage because they know those students will always do the work of answering your questions or engaging in your activities. So that consolidation of responsibility is a norm that's very powerful. Every student's experienced it. They've all been in classes where they're the ones that are either participate all the time or where they know there are 3 or 4 students which are always going to participate. So that norm is so powerful, we have to reshape that somehow. And so he sort of, here's a way to think about what we see there. If we walk into a classroom and say, okay, does anyone have questions? Or get in little groups and discuss. Or does anyone want to start the discussion, right? When we do that, we just throw those open-ended questions out like that. We see that consolidation of responsibility happening, right? A small number of students will dominate the discussion. The students maybe perhaps the students who don't want to discuss, who don't want to get involved, they can just sit there. The students who are quiet or anxious, they're not going to jump in and try to speak over that dominant student. Students in a small group might sort of start wandering off track with these sort of open-ended questions. Most importantly, some voices might be sort of pushed out or like sort of silenced essentially by these dominant voices who always want to jump in and engage. Okay, so that's a consolidation of responsibility. There are other norms that get in the way of us participating. And the remedy for that problem, and for many of the problems that we see with engagement in the classroom, is what another group of researchers calls high structure. High structure is the idea is that the more structure we put into our teaching practices, the more that we create an environment that helps all students succeed. And high structure means we're going to build in frequent touch point throughout the class period. The students have to participate in some way or another. It's not always going to be the same thing, raise hands and open discussion, but we're going to create multiple touch points in which students have to do something in the class period. Okay, and this research has shown us, and this comes from the book by Kelly Hogan and Vijay Sathi, when we put more structure into our teaching, it helps everyone, but especially helps students who are minoritized, students who have mental health issues, or students who have like opportunity gaps. Their prior schooling has not been great. Maybe their family backgrounds have not really been conducive for them to do well in school. Those students are especially helped by high structure. So high structure is a remedy for many of the things that go wrong in terms of engagement. So I'm going to give an example of what my high structure might look like as a way to kind of address both these issues together, shaping norms and then using high structure. So I love to think about the fact, again, you can see now how much I love opening and closing minutes of the class period. And so I like to think about opening and closing statements. Let's say students come to the class period, they've done some reading, they're trying to solve a problem, whatever it might be, in their homework or even just processing from the previous class period. Starting by saying to the class, okay, everyone will respond from the reading or the homework with, any of these options here. Everyone has to say one single word in response to the reading. So for me as a teacher of literature, I might use this one. What's your one-word reaction to the short story you read? Or a single sentence. What's one thing you learned, for example, from your textbook reading last night? Or, a 30-second reflection. So everyone gets 30 seconds. I'm going to give it 30 seconds for you to speak. You don't have to have like anything, really formally articulated. Just speak for 30 seconds as your reaction to what you did last night in your homework. Or, a 1-minute conversation with a peer, right? The important thing about this one is everyone speaks, right? So this is what we call these opening or closing statements. Everyone has to say an opening statement. Now, if you have a big class, maybe the one word is the way to do this. Or, the one sentence might be enough. If you have like a smaller class, 30 seconds or a minute might be enough. It gives you a little bit more time for them to really sort of think out loud. Again, do a little retrieval practice, but then also, hear their voices in the classroom and make sure everyone participates. So if you're teaching in a big classroom, like a larger class, you can always divide the classroom into segments. So for example, like this half today this half goes opening statements. Tomorrow or the next class period, this half will do their opening statements. Okay. The way I like to think about this is I want to hear every student's voice in the classroom at least once a week. So I can certainly throw things out and say, okay, just ask for volunteers. But this is a way to say, yes, you can volunteer if you want, but I'm going to hear from you from your opening statement. So this is an example of a high structure activity done at the beginning or the end of the class period. Visions and Hogan use the example of think, pair, share. This is a very common technique in education, right? Students throw out a question, students then have to think about it, pair up with each other and talk about, and then share it with the whole room. Hogan and Sathy calls it the little black dress of teaching and learning. In other words, it's a very versatile thing that can go with a lot of different things, other things you might be doing in the class period. They argue there's a few things to think about when you do think, pair, shares, which is don't omit the thinking time. We sometimes want to sort of jump right into the pairs or the talking as a whole group. Give them that 30 seconds. Use a timer in your phone or the classroom. Give them that 30 seconds. They have to just sit and think before they start talking. Circulate around the room to ensure that everyone's participating. Because again, if students can just sit there and just not talk to each other, so you want to circulate around the room and say, okay, hey, what do you guys think? That kind of thing. And of course, it's important if you do the think, pair, share part. The share part is explain beforehand. I'm going to ask some of you to share. Even if you don't volunteer, I'm going to ask somebody to share. So then that gives them more incentive to actually talk about their peers and think about what their answers might look like. Okay, so sorry about that. The third example I'm going to give you is what I call participating with your feet. These are two examples of techniques I like to use myself. So let's say, I had my students speaking in class plenty, and they're doing a good job of that. But maybe some students are really not participating that much because they're quiet students, they're shy, they're introverted. But I still want those students to be fully engaged in the class, even if they are not speaking out loud to the whole room. These are two techniques I really like to make sure that everyone essentially moves around and makes a commitment to an idea or position or a solution to something in the classroom. So these are called value lines or four corners. So four corners and value lines are different ways to have students respond to a question or give their opinion about something or share a solution or idea or like align themselves with a strategy or a solution by asking them to actually get up out of their seats and move to a position in the room that demonstrates how they feel about something. For example, when I do this work with faculty, I will, if we were together in a room, which I wish we were, I might say to you, okay, do you believe we should grade student participation in the classroom? And I would say, okay, if you really believe this grading participation is very important and we should do it, I want you to stand in this corner against the wall. If you don't believe in grading participation, I want you to stand over here. And then if you're not sure, you can stand in the middle here. So that's a value line, right? We're going across a line. Now, as a teacher, in that situation, I have my students get up and stand in a line. And I'm going to say, okay, now I can just walk down the line and say, okay, tell me, why are you standing there? Now, I can ask students for volunteers, or I can actually invite them to speak. Either way, though, every student has made a commitment to a position based just on getting up out of their seat and moving to a particular spot on the wall. I did this with my students this summer, actually, in a class, and we're talking about artificial intelligence. And so the question was, do you believe artificial intelligence will be good ultimately or negative for the future of learning? They had to line up like that. It was quite interesting to see where they line up, and it's interesting for them also to see where they line up. Because if you might just sort of ask students to respond in by raising their hands, that's done very quickly, and you maybe not remember who said what. When you're up on that value line, it's very visible what everyone thinks. Now, four corners is a different way to do that. I'm going to have like four solutions to a problem, and then I have students go to the corners of the room. And then I can go around those corners and say, okay, tell me why you're standing here. What's your idea? And again, this is very visible to everyone, how things kind of played out. And you can do that not only with just like different ideas, but also like, as you see here in the graphic, I agree, disagree, strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree, right? So we can, again, get everyone out of their seats, That's good. Obviously, that's good for attention, right? Because again, if a lecture's going on for a long time, for example, getting people out of their seats and moving around is a great thing. Um, so it helps people, gives you a little break, something different to do, and then have students again make a commitment with their feet. Okay, so four corners or value lines, another way to think about high structure. Because again, high structure piece is there. Everyone has to move. Everyone has to make a commitment either way. To stand somewhere in the room to demonstrate their beliefs. Finally, there's a debate about this last one, and I'm going to tell you why I believe in what I call invitational participation. People talk about the fact that, should we call on students if they have not volunteered? That's why this problem of consolidation of responsibility happens, because we're not doing that. We're essentially saying, okay, who wants to talk? I'm going to invite you to raise your hands. If you raise your hands, I'll call on you. But again, that leaves a lot of students out of the room. I believe we should use what I call invitational participation, which means I'm going to invite you to participate. I can ask for hands and volunteers. That's great. But sometimes I'm going to say to different students, say, okay, tell me what you think. Now, I'm not going to do that in like a sort of aggressive way, like I'm not challenging them to a duel. But the idea here is that I'm going to invite everyone to engage, even the ones who have not volunteered to engage, right? Again, I'm trying to put more structure onto this by giving me more responsibility in terms of making sure that everyone is participating in the class period. Now, here's the way I describe this to my own students, because I know some students don't like this. They don't want to be called on unless they have volunteered. But because we know that volunteering in class or speaking in class is such a good thing for learning, I want to make sure they understand why I'm doing it. But here's the syllabus statement I give to my students. I explain to them, okay, this is a student-centered class where a lot of learning activities, class discussions, there'll be a lot of opportunities to talk and think. But this is really important. Your unique voice, your perspective, your ideas are very valuable and might bring something to the conversation that nobody else has considered, including me. So I need to hear from you. I need to hear from everyone. Your conversation will be less rich if we're only here from 3 or 4 people throughout the course of the semester, right? The more voices are in the room, the more ideas can develop and deepen, right? I do also want to acknowledge the students, and I say this not only in this statement, but also in class. If there's some reason you really can't participate, for example, in accommodations or some reason why you can't, it's really challenging for you to participate, I'll work with you. I'll try to find other ways for you to participate. But I want you to be aware that this is really important to me as your teacher. I want to hear from you. Every voice, every week. And invitational participation is a great way to ensure that every voice is heard in the room every single week. Okay. All right. So those are 4 ideas there. Opening and closing statements, think, pair, shares, participating with your feet, and invitational participation. These are ways to add more structure to our classroom engagement opportunities. And that to me is another way that we can ensure that we are reshaping participation norms in a positive way. Okay, that's it. These are things to remember. We want to put greater structure into active learning exercises in the classroom, right? Putting more structure, high structure into the classroom. Create participation norms that support daily engagement. And finally, using invitational participation to ensure that students maybe who don't volunteer are still going to be part of the conversation. Okay, so those are our 2 principles of student engagement and retrieval practice. One was kind of focused on developing knowledge. The other one was focused more on like participation and engagement. If you look at the book, you'll find 7 other principles designed to kind of give you ideas for ways you can make small changes to your teaching in ways that support and enhance student learning. So I'm grateful for you for you being here with me today. And I hope good luck. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and good luck with your teaching, whether it's small or big or medium size. Otherwise, but good luck in improving student learning in your classes, and having a great year of academic year for student learning. Thank you.